everybody. It's an absolute pleasure for me to really be the host for this dialogue called the Thinkers Dialogue. Quite interestingly, I must share that this is an initiative which is going to be a weekly interaction that we're going to have with the foremost thinkers across the world, and wherein we are really going to talk about things like violence, democracy, capitalism, philosophy, and how the world is actually changing. If you really look at the world today, the world is going through some dramatic changes, and this has started happening in the last 20 to 30 years. And how this is really going to affect our lives is the question that we are really going to be asking to our guests over a period of time. So, as you look at the series, we have one of the foremost thinkers in the world in the area of philosophy, who's joined us today, and he's none other than Brad Evans, who's there with me today. In fact, quite interestingly, I must share who Brad is. Brad is a political philosopher, a critical theorist who's been a prolific writer, a movie maker, in fact, a person who wears many, many hats. But quite interestingly, he works in a very interesting area called violence. And he's written about 17 books, edited volumes, written tons and tons of academic papers and media articles, has been somebody who's created a series with the New York Times. He's actually doing something with the Los Angeles Review on Los Angeles Review of Books, and so on and so forth. In fact, I would suggest that you should go to his website, History of Violence, and see his work, and probably go to his university website as well, where he's a professor. So he's a professor at the University of Bath in UK, and that's where I would request you to really all go and see his work. But then one very interesting thing, in fact, Russell Brand actually says that he is the George Clooney of philosophy. So somebody who's like an absolutely a stunning person, who is like more like I would say a great actor, maybe at some point in time, somebody who's creating impact, and so on and so forth. So Brad, thanks a lot for joining us today and really helping us kickstart this series called the Thinkers Dialogue, and being our first guest for the show. Thanks a lot, Brad.
No, thanks for inviting me, and it's an honor to kickstart this initiative of yours. I think it's a great initiative, so thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Brad. So we will quickly get into the conversation here today. Brad, I must ask you a question. In fact, what fascinates you in this world in terms of this idea of violence, and what drives you to work in this area? Why focus on this? Because it seems to be a very dangerous area to actually work in, because you can actually have points of view which could be different, which could be diagrammatically opposite to a lot of people in the world. So it could be a very dangerous area to work on. So what motivated you to move towards that idea?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think like many people, we're all too aware of the presence of violence in our lives, but and I think you're right, we tend not to think about it. We tend not to try to dwell upon violence, and we try not to kind of, I agree with Richard Bernstein that in our societies, we're saturated by images and representations of violence, but we don't like to dwell upon it philosophically or politically for too much length of time. It's just violence is like, we think that something that other people do, or violence is something which exists elsewhere. Whereas actually we know that if we simply look around in our societies, the violence is everywhere, right? So and I think the thing that I've been really trying to come to terms with, first of all, was how do we understand the ways in which our societies are born of violence, have been made through violence, but even to try to think about the ways in which, what does the term violence actually mean? Well, when is something violent, right? So does violence necessarily need to, mean physical bodily harm, or can we actually talk? And if that is the case, then what types of bodily harm do we refer to as violence, or just simply the collateral effects of economic devastation and so forth? So for me, there was a great deal of, I guess, of soul searching that kind of happened, I think, roughly around 1998, when I first became aware of the Zapatista group in Mexico. But then the more I kind of started to research violence, I guess it was more kind of, coming to terms with my own past as well. And I grew up in the mining communities of South Wales, which are in the United Kingdom, amongst the most poorest communities in the United Kingdom. And I also grew up on one of the most notorious council estates in this area. And you kind of realize that when you grow up, actually, is that, you know, children in particular, but young people, we have this brilliant ability to forget the bad stuff and remember just the good, happy times of our lives. And I think for me, then, trying to come to terms with violence was also perhaps a way of trying to come to terms with the past in which I lived, where I grew up in an area which was very violent and very, and I don't mean just, you know, not just politically violent, but also endemic poverty, chronic, you know, drug abuse, you know, random violence which was taking place, you know, pretty much every time you went out on a weekend. And I think so to try to come to terms with that as well was also then, to me, demanded more, you know, detailed thinking around, okay, well, what is this thing, right? How does it, you know, make demands upon us? And not just to see perhaps violence as something which is associated with what like Freud might call a death drive, or violence which is something which is purely negative, but the way in which violence has and continues to transform our societies and the demands it places upon us. I think those were questions which from 1998 onwards really started to impress on me. And then, of course, you have the wars on terror and all the kind of global consequences of those very visceral and abhorrent acts of media violence we became more and more, you know, aware of. And I think, to me, then there was so many pressing questions which, once you start, it's almost like, you know, there's this point which, like Nietzsche says, you know, be careful that you don't stare into the abyss, because the abyss will stare back at you. And I think it's right in the context of violence, in the sense of the more you research it, the more violence you find. And it's very difficult then to kind of leave it, because it leaves you with more and more questions. So I think that was always then my kind of, you know, my journey into violence. And it's a journey now where I'm kind of, you know, I've just finished writing a book where it kind of deals with, you know, it's called Ecce Humanitas, Beholding the Pain of Humanity. And it's coming out with Columbia University Press in July. And I've kind of ended up going back to Dante. And, you know, and Dante, you know, we might know that this year is the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And even now, his mediation on witnessing violence is still so prescient to our world. You know, we still haven't confronted the questions which Dante was asking us to consider 700 years ago. So I think there's so much still to be asked about violence.
This is fascinating. And you actually said something very interesting in your statement, and that was that societies are born of violence. So are you saying that violence is something which has just been prevalent across the board? You've also said that, of course, like inequality could be something which depicts violence itself. So could you give me some insights in terms of like how societies have really grown over a period of time, how violence has actually affected our thinking and our quality of life or our living?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, you know, certainly, for instance, if you look in the Western context, right, we know no narrative of our history which doesn't begin with a story of violence. So if we just walk into, for instance, any natural history museum, it's the depiction that it presents of human life and the human condition. I'm just saying this is a story, right? It's not necessarily true, but the story we like to tell ourselves is of humans who are born and thrown into a world and thrown into a condition which is survival. And the history that we like to tell ourselves then is one of survival against the elements, survival against nature, survival against other tribes, survival against other nations, survival against nuclear holocaust, you know. So all these kind of stories that we tell ourselves, you know, we present ourselves in terms of the evolution of the human condition with what I've called a natural history of violence. And this is very much embedded in our cultures. It's like as if we know no other history without this. Now, perhaps part of our task is to unwrap a different version of history, because we know this is not the only version of history available to us, but certainly this is the narrative we tell ourselves. And then if we look back then at the history, for instance, of Western civilization, you know, we know, for instance, that Western literature begins with a Shelley story of the Oresteia, you know, and it begins as a story of war, with Agamemnon killing his daughter, and then, you know, Clytemnestra taking over and invoking a regime of terror. The history of Western societies is premised on violence. the history of colonization was deeply violent, and we continue. And this is a strange thing in terms of, when we think about, people would like right after September the 11th, this is an age of exceptional politics. And, what's happening now is, an exceptional violence and an exceptional response. It wasn't exceptional at all. That kind of violence is completely normal to the human condition. Who on earth didn't expect America to go to war after 9/11? Right? It was inevitable. It was that this is the way we resolve our problems, and I think that, so. That idea, I don't think I can't name one single society on earth and one single nation on earth which hasn't been born of violence in one way or another. We might even point to, the beloved Scandinavian countries of Switzerland and Sweden, which like to place themselves on the plinth of peace. But actually, their economies are deeply invested in the global arms trade and are very much integrated in global ideas of war. And, so I think this idea of, so I think that it raises interesting questions for me around what might then a non-violent society look like? Or do we need to give ourselves a more, promising understanding of the history of the human condition, which doesn't place its star point as one that begins with violence? Because then it's not just about reimagining the future, perhaps, but it's how we reimagine the past too. Because also I don't buy into this conceit that humans are simply naturally violent. And I think, because actually I think it takes a great deal of effort to engage in violence. Perhaps sometimes the question we need to ask ourselves is, why are we not more violent, right, on an individual level? We know actually that, people offend us and deeply wound us, in many different ways, but we don't respond violently. I think actually it takes a lot for somebody to be violent individually. So in that sense, then I don't buy into the idea either that humans are simply naturally violent. Violence is organized. Very little violence is random or spontaneous. So I think we need to understand then that kind of seeming contradiction, but it's not a contradiction. Where on the one hand, we are presented with a history of the human condition, which is deeply violent. But then on the other hand, most humans will go throughout their lives without being violent. So I think that there's something, we need to come to terms with in that contradiction.
So, Brad, there is always this debate that actually happens. When you talk about societies being violent and everything has emerged from violence. So I have to ask you a question. Could be a very tricky one. But then do you think, how do you really look at religion in this context? In the context of history, in the context of violence? Because somehow it seems quite a lot of religions must have actually arisen out of violent behavior or violence over a period of time.
Mm-hmm. So, like I mentioned in this previous answer, but this new book that I'm working on, basically the book is a critique of what is called sacred violence. Right? And sacred violence was a concept which was initially developed by the phenomenal thinker René Girard. Now, I agree with René Girard in the sense that I don't think history is defined by class war, or I don't think history is defined by race war. I think history is defined by religious war. And history actually is the continuation of religious war. So, and what I mean by that, René Girard has this theory where he basically says that, society begins with sacrifice, that we have sacrifices. Just think, for instance, of the sacrifice of Christ as the obvious example, which Girard uses, right? And Girard says you have this kind of abhorrent violence, but this violence is necessary because it allows us to set in place the morality of society. So in other words, for Girard, we always need the sacrifice to let us know what is permissible in a society. So in other words, we will never truly banish violence. We just need to regulate it. Now, religion becomes the vehicle for this, historically. Religion is, and in that sense, of course, without getting too philosophical, this is the way in which we then understand metaphysics. You wouldn't have a Christian metaphysics were it not for the sacrifice of Jesus, right? But you can latch this onto the modern nation state. A modern nation state would not have very little appeal to us were it not willing to appeal to the sacrifices of the past. So, Francisco de Goya understood this. Francisco de Goya was the very first artist to paint what Nietzsche calls the death of God. And what Goya understands, for instance, in his representations of violence is how the body of Christ is replaced by the body of the hero. So the hero now becomes the new sacrificial motif for society. And this is where I agree with Carl Schmitt. The modern societies are basically adaptations of theology, that we always need the theological from time to time in order to make our appeal to some idea of the greater good, the morality and so forth. And I think in that sense, then, the history of our societies is a history of religious wars. And I don't just mean in terms of orthodox religion, I mean in terms of the multiple ways that theology can permeate our societies and make us behave in theological ways which we don't even recognize as being theological. Now, one of the questions then which I like to ask myself is, okay, how do we understand, and this is what I do in this book, what then, if we want to call maybe the change in sacred object for power, how do we understand the way in which this has transformed over time? If the body of Jesus was the sacred object for Christianity, and the body of the hero becomes the sacred object for states, what we've witnessed over the last 30 years is how the victim themselves becomes a sacred object. Right. So, and what I mean by this, we can think of this, I think there's a very pivotal moment in the late 1960s, and that is the representation of the burning Vietnamese girl called Kim Phuc. And, her image of her running down the street in itself with her arms out wide is very iconic and very theological, right? She's like a surrogate Christ on the cross whose back is burning as she's running down the street. And there's a Christian theology at work there. But the victim becomes a sacred object in particularly liberal politics, where it's okay to go to war in order to uphold the idea that their sacrifice was worth it. So how many times, for instance, have we justified bombing around the world to liberate women or to liberate children, or, so we're carrying out violence in the name of the sacred victim. And I think that to me is why then, liberal wars that we've seen over the past 20, 30 years are an extension of religious war. They use the motif of what we call just violence. Just war is a profoundly theological doctrine. So I think we cannot understand the history of the human condition and its violence without understanding religion, but also the way in which religion itself is not simply just Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Religion can permeate our societies, and that's why it's so, formidable, really. The way in which it adapts and can work with secularization and can work with, and that's where I agree with Nietzsche. When Nietzsche was saying, we need to think beyond good and evil, right? We need, I think what he's really saying is we need to think beyond the sacred. This idea that it's okay to kill for the greater good. And I think that is what the sacred ultimately means, that it's okay for us to kill as long as we can connect it to some metaphysics, to some idea that this killing is worth it. And I think that's where, the religious always smuggles itself in to even the most secular ideas.
So how do we resolve this problem? Because historically, if that's where it is, like if history is full of religious wars, or that is how the world has actually come to be, how do we really create societies today? Like, what do you think would be the ideal situation? We can't really say that religion is going to be thrown out of the window, or it has to be discarded in the dustbin of history. Then how do we really set societies which are going to be just, humane, and not violent?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really important, and I'm not saying it's an impossible to answer question, but I agree with you in the sense that we also have to come to terms with the fact that religion or spirituality or something along that lines means so much to so many people, right? Because, and perhaps part of the issue is, especially in our societies today, where we are taught to believe that, this delusion that we will find happiness through material enrichment, for instance. We know this is a fallacy. We know this is an illusion, right? That this idea that we will find a meaningful or a valuable life simply through commodification. Anybody who's existed with any kind of degree of relative privilege, in terms of even if you grew out of poverty like I did, and then suddenly you find yourself having the slightest bit of disposable income that you can buy just something nice for yourself, that that's just an illusion that very quickly dissipates, right? So we don't find happiness as humans through commodification. Now the then question then becomes, well, okay, where do then people find then meaning and value in life? Well, obviously, there's a return back to religion. There's a return back to spirituality, because it gives a sense of meaning to people's lives, which otherwise just appears to be vacuous and abstract in a way which is just linked to, if I have the best car or the nicest house or whatever else, even though you might have all those material possessions and you are miserable as sin, right? So I think there is something then in that moment that we need to recognize, okay, to me, it's not an answer, but it's a question around, okay, what does a meaningful life look like? Or more importantly, perhaps, what does a meaningful life feel like? Because, we need to feel valued. We need to feel that we're living a meaningful existence. Now, to me, then, we are kind of then caught in this kind of unhealthy dialectic between either materiality or a spirituality which has to uphold life as some kind of sacred value in need of saving, and we will justify whatever we need to do because it's for the greater good of humanity, and therefore we will commit wars and violence in its name, and so on. And I think perhaps, we need a different conversation, and a different conversation which is based on the idea of non-exclusionary conversations. And too often, and this is one of the dangers which I see, particularly in certain, I've grown up in the tradition of leftist politics, but I see today the way in which the left is collapsing into a completely morally certain religiosity, actually very dangerous for the world, because this idea that we know what's best for the world, we know what's morally right, we know what's morally certain. And I think what we need to have is perhaps a more humble and open conversation with people. For me to say to somebody who's, devoutly religious, well, okay, I understand that your beliefs matter to you, but can you not see also the way in which the sacred has been so complicit in histories of violence, right? So how can we have then an open and meaningful conversation which is not premised on ideas of universality, that we all, that I'm suddenly Brad Evans and I have the solution to the world because my idea is the best idea and I'm not willing to entertain any other ideas, but actually what we might call an ethics of difference, which, and this is not about, saying, well, let's say that the Taliban are right. It's not about that. It's about, of course, we can condemn authoritarian groups, and of course we can condemn groups which are very pernicious in their violence, but it's still to have a recognition that humans have different ideas about what a meaningful life means. But it is something that we do kind of share as as part of the human condition, is that we all, I think, want to live a meaningful life in one way or another, however that kind of looks for us. And I think to have an open conversation, and a more open conversation on that, which doesn't go back to our early conversation, doesn't look like something on Twitter, right? It demands, a more sustained reflection. And to give you just one obvious example, September the 11th, 2001 was such an important event in history. We know that now. We can see, and it raised so many important questions for us. Now, to me, first of all, what made 9/11 so unique wasn't the spectacle of violence. We've seen those spectacles of violence before. And actually, we actually relived 9/11 so many times in Hollywood before the event actually happened, right? But the first thing, of course, what made 9/11 very important was how a handful of nameable individuals created the image of a global security crisis. Not armies of millions like Hitler. This was 19 nameable individuals who create the image of a global security crisis, which could only come about through new media technologies. The fact that the world was now broadcast live to us in any given moment. But the second point, which was to me more crucial about 9/11, was the speed of response. That we, Tony Blair, the British leader, says, this is the day the world changes forever. Right? This is, Tony Blair, this is the day the world changes forever. We go to war 2 weeks later. If it truly was the day the world changed forever, surely we should have spent more time, considering the political and philosophical consequences, rather than simply say, okay, right, back to war, right? So, and I think this is another thing that perhaps we need, when you talk about, okay, what does the ideal society look like? I don't think it's an ideal, but I do think that perhaps one of the things which defines, as the brilliant late philosopher Paul Virilio argued, is that our societies are now defined by speed. We want to speed up everything, right? The speeding up of communication, the speeding up of the flows of life, the speeding up of technological innovation without thinking of the consequences of them. And I think if we are going to have a new politics, we need time to reflect on global events, time to reflect on global problems. And I think perhaps what our politics needs is the slowing of things down, to take our time more, to reflect upon the histories of suffering, to reflect more deeply about what it means to have, a meaningful dialogue amongst Jewish communities and Islamic communities. How do this is not something that happens overnight. And I think that we need to maybe recognize and have a more open dialogue and say, well, look, maybe some of these as your question intimates, since time immemorial, we've had this kind of religious violence. Okay, right? Maybe we need to put history on a different path and kind of say, well, okay, how do we mediate and overcome this? But that will take time. And I think, but those conversations, that part of the problem that we have is that time has now been almost written out of the script. We demand immediate responses now. We demand immediate solutions. Whereas actually, how wonderful would it be for a politician to suddenly say, look, I've got no immediate solutions for you. I've got no immediate, answers, but let's at least have a proper conversation. Let's, I'm not going to give you immediate results to what you want to resolve global conflict, but let's take our time and really work through this properly. And I think that would be so refreshing for any leader globally to say that.
So this is very interesting, Brad. But then when you say that politicians will possibly need time, or they should be given time at some point, if you really look at this conversation. But then, like in the world which is driven by social media, where everything is so instantaneous, as you said in your previous answer itself, you are living in a state where information is being hounded onto you, or it is being pushed onto you. In the world which is full of Twitter users, the information can just go from one end of the world to the other end in less than a minute. Everybody is probably tweeting about it. So in a world which is driven by instantaneous information and they need instantaneous solutions, how do you think politicians will be able to survive that? They are possibly being pushed into that arena of immediacy because of the way we are actually living our lives today. And that has affected, and this has possibly happened in the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like many people, I was initially seduced by social media. And don't get me wrong, I think, some of the technological advances that we have witnessed over the last 20 years have been phenomenal. The fact that we can even have this conversation, right? So I think that in itself, technology can be remarkably enabling if it is actually done in a considered way. And I'd like to think, for instance, this conversation is an opening, and like what you're trying to do is an opening in terms of let's have a sustained rigorous conversation, right? It's not about imposing ideas. It's about saying, okay, let's open up and have a rigorous conversation. But there's another aspect to social media, which, as you say, is based on a certain demand for immanence. And that immanence I find to be not only problematic, it is highly dangerous. It is based often on a politics of shaming. You know, one of the things which defined fascism historically was publicly shaming people. This has now become democratized, right? We see this every single day on Twitter. You know, the shaming of J.K. Rowling because of her biological beliefs or whatever. You know, I disagree with what J.K. Rowling thinks about biology, but she has every single right to hold those opinions. You know, and it's not about some angry mob shaming her on social media because we disagree with what she happens to believe. And I think that there's a side to, I think we confuse on social media today information with knowledge. So, you know, anybody can have an opinion. Right? Anybody can, you know, tweet an opinion. Most, you know, and I've recognized this myself, you know, that I've done initiatives where, you know, people have participated and they are, you know, very active on social media. They will tweet something out. Immediately it has hundreds and hundreds of retweets and whatever else. But when I actually look at whether people have actually gone to the actual recordings they've done for me, there's zero. There's no engagement with what they're actually tweeting about. So it's a very, you know, false, shallow, fabricated. It's easy to retweet something. It's easy to be angry at something without actually looking behind that and say, okay, let's deal with the substantive details. You know, somebody will record a podcast or a video for me, and they'll get hundreds of tweets, hundreds of likes, but very few people actually engage with the substance of what is actually the tweet about. And I think that in itself reveals to me something about that kind of engagement. And, you know, and I think there's also something, you know, I don't want to kind of beat up on millennials here, right? But there is something about a millennial politics that, you know, for instance, you know, for all the problems, for instance, of, you know, that I've found like historically about Islamic societies in terms of some of the ways in which its politics operates. The one thing that I find, you know, very refreshing about Islamic politics sometimes, and the same I find in Latin America too, is the recognition that elders of societies are the ones you should listen to, right? That you should respect people who have lived, who have experienced life in a way that recognizes that it's only through time that you can really truly philosophize about the meaning of life, about violence, about, you know, the human condition. And this to me is, you know, is so important philosophically that, you know, one of the great theorists of immanence, arguably the theorist who's the most important on immanence, was the French post-structural philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze's entire philosophical orientation was all about how do we think immanently? How do we develop an ethics of immanence? And, you know, Deleuze is so important for thinking about the advent of complexity science, the advent of post-structural theory, the breaking out of, you know, the move towards complexity in thinking, the move towards, you know, complexities of ecology. Without Deleuze, we wouldn't have had some of the most important advances in terms of philosophy in that field of study. Deleuze also says that you can only philosophize with age. So here we have this theorist who writes about control societies, who recognizes the importance of immanent thinking, but also says this only comes with experience. You can't just simply be, you know, 19 years old, suddenly take to Twitter and you have 1 million followers, and therefore the world should suddenly, you know, followers in itself is a theological term, right? You know, you know, and suddenly you know about the world and you can transform the world. And I'm not trying to diminish the ideas of youth, because of course they're very important, and they're, you know, but we also, you know, we need to recognize that there are so many brilliant people who are not on social media who, who have so many important things to say because they are 65, 70, 80 years old, and I sometimes think of, that I had the privilege of knowing, to me, one of the most brilliant intellects who I ever met in my life was the late Zygmunt Bauman, who was such a phenomenal thinker, and such an astute thinker, who was, the last person on earth who would ever be on social media. And how dearly we miss his voice right now, because there was no better critic of the state of the world than Bauman. But not somebody who would simply tweet what he felt, because that was, but who would take time to reflect, a survivor of the Holocaust, a survivor of somebody who, fled Nazi Germany, fled persecution, then in Soviet Russia, and somebody who really understood the human condition. And I think that too often we give ourselves over to social media as being the definitive arena of truth in the world, whereas actually it's very dangerous, I think, on many occasions. So.
This is interesting. And, like just taking the conversation ahead, social media does something very interesting. And of course, like it creates a very shallow debate that can actually happen. But it also saturates us with images of violence over a period of time. Like everything just seems to be so violent around us. And when we start looking at social media, so how do we set this right? How do we tell millennials, or how do we tell the youth that you have to go in depth to whatever you are actually looking at? It is more than 240 characters that you have to look at, because you're also alluding to something very interesting, that you have to look at rationality, you have to look at uh, deeply written words, which are probably a little longer than 240 characters. So you are also hinting at some very strong opinion on how education has to be looked at, how things might have to change across the board, and how opinions will have to be formed. How do you really react to this proposition or an idea?
Yeah, I agree. And, one of the, one of the saddest things I experience sometimes in education is, when students or people who ask me for my opinions are very dismissive of thinkers very quickly because of a tweet they've read, or because of a couple of words that somebody might have said on a tweet, and then suddenly it becomes something which is, we can dismiss the entire legacy or life of a person and their work and their history, because and there's almost like this, I'm not just saying this doesn't happen sometimes with students, it also happens with some academics too, that there's this kind of assumption, oh, well, if only this person knew my arguments, or if only they did the work. And there's a kind of arrogance which permeates social media, which kind of assumes that other people don't know the arguments, or haven't done the work, or haven't done the reading, right? So, but I do think with social media, you're right, that it's easy now to do these kind of, I say these very kind of quick fire kind of things with the hope that something will go viral. Whereas, some of the greatest books in history never went viral, right? It took centuries before people actually read them, right? So, it's not like an immediate kind of response, very few people read Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil when he was writing it, so it's not a thing of immediacy that we're looking for you. But I think also your point about, again, one of the defining factors of social media also is the way in which it operates at the level of emotion. And, one of the great casualties after World War II was that nobody really wanted to talk about emotion in politics. Emotion was seen as dangerous, right? So for all the obvious reasons that are associated, for instance, with the likes of Adolf Hitler, Wilhelm Reich understood this brilliantly in his book on the mass psychology of fascism, where emotion gets mobilized to devastating effect. Now, but that was, so we have emotion written out of politics for, nearly 30, 40 years. Now, thankfully, there's been a return to recognize that emotion is important for understanding politics. But also, this can also permeate in terms of, what we might call a tyranny of emotions as well. And if you think in terms of the way in which social media operates, it's now based on the truth of emotions. My emotions are authentic, your emotions are inauthentic, therefore I must be right, and we need to shut your ideas down, right? So, and this is based on a politics of emotion, which is, you know, if we're adapting the ideas of Georges Bataille, we might call it the affected share, right? That everybody's now affected in one way or another, or at least they tell you they are on social media. And I think it's quite an interesting experiment. If you walk down a street and you're on Twitter, you know, you can read social media and it's almost like everybody's almost on the point of civil war, right? But actually you're walking down the street and people are happily just queuing for their latte with their face mask on, being highly obedient, probably assassinating the person in front of them while they're waiting for a coffee. You've never ever met this person before, but they're killing them on social media, right? So there's a real strange dichotomy at work there. And I think the other point, then you're right, connecting this to your question about images or representations of violence. And I'm thinking about that kind of, you know, the recent program that we went on to with on the newsmakers. You know, this idea that the world somehow feels now that this was the worst year ever, and all this kind of, you know, preposterous narratives. You know, what would social media have looked like during World War II? You know, during the height of World War II, what would social media have looked like? Or even during the Spanish flu, where 50 million people are killed, right? You know, and not just 50 million elderly people, you know, 50 million able-bodied people. You know, so to me, I think part of the trauma of social media is also to make us believe now that we are the most afflicted people historically, that we suffer more than anybody else, that we suffer greater than anybody else, that, you know, and we are the sacred victims of history, right? That, you know, nobody really suffers like this. Even though we might have grown up with a family which is very wealthy, with a family who's providing me with a private education, a family who is sending me to one of the elite universities in the world, but you know what? I've suffered more than anybody historically. And I think there is something in that then that social media enables that. And I'm not saying that people don't suffer on their own terms, but we need to also have a healthy perspective on that precise history that you talk about.
So you know, this is so interesting. And you have written about this in the past, but are you really saying that there is something called as the challenge of ignorance or weaponization of or refusal to acknowledge? Is that really happening across in the world today? And the people are not acknowledging as to what's happening around them, or are we weaponizing ignorance and really pushing things forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, Henry Giroux has this brilliant term, what he calls the violence of organized forgetting. And what we have on the one hand, I think, you know, we've never known more in many ways about history, right? So, you know, we have all these systems now where, you know, when I went to university, you know, if I wanted to get, for instance, you know, even a simple article, I had to wait 2 months for an interlibrary loan to get this article sent to me. This is at the infancy of the internet. Today, you know, we have too much information, you know, and the problems I encounter, for instance, with students, is not me saying to them, well, just try to go to the library and hopefully you can get this one book because this one book is the real one you should read. Today, it's a problem of saying, well, actually, we have too much stuff. And how can I weave out the things which I think are really important for you to read, right? So I think that's part of the problem. But so it's not like we lack information. We have too much of it, perhaps, sometimes. What I think we do lack is the ability to perhaps, and again, this comes down to speed and time, and, you know, to have a sustained reflection on history, to put things, you know, this idea of putting things in perspective. And I always think that this phrase of putting things in perspective is so important, because when we talk about putting things in perspective, not only does that require a new angle of vision on something, but putting things in perspective is also about time. It's about distance. It's about how do we have a perspective with the past? How do we put our lives in perspective with the past? How do we put our lives in perspective when we, you know, we recognize this past in a way that allows us to really kind of, you know, recognize that, yes, we might be facing challenges. Yes, the pandemic is deeply has posed so many questions for us. Yes, the pandemic will create so many unknown mental health issues. Let's deal with this. Let's recognize these problems. But also, let's recognize the kind of privileges that many people in the Western world have, where it's okay to lock down, right? It's okay to say, well, actually, I can lock down, I can do my teaching, I can do whatever else I need to do. Without feeling like we're the most afflicted population historically. And I think that those kinds of things also is where the perspective needs to come, because, or even the most afflicted people live in today. This idea that, I might be middle class, wealthy, go to an elite institution, but you know what? I suffer far more than somebody who lives in acute poverty in the United Kingdom, because of their identity fabric or whatever else. I think we need to really have a sense of, maybe stop collapsing microaggressions with actual physical violence too. And I think there's something that we also need to open up as a serious conversation there. So.
Mhm. So, just moving ahead on this, like, there's a very interesting question from one of our members here on the Zoom. He says,
Mhm.
like, what effect does cancellation of content such as movies or cartoons that today are categorized as homophobic or racist have on society? In fact, we've also seen at one point that there are those statues which are actually being thrown out into the rivers or whatever, saying, oh, we do not actually have to respect those people. How do you really look at this? Because this in itself seems to be very violent behavior in terms of not accepting the past or not really being, uh, uh, we are trying to be oblivious of reality that actually exists. And we're just trying to disdain everything, and we're just trying to discard everything that has happened, and trying to say that we are actually going to create something which is far better or whatever. But eventually we are moving towards far more violent behavior.
Hmm. Well, so first of all, I think we have to recognize, if we're dealing with this idea of what's called cancel culture, right? First of all, this is not new, right? So, and actually, historically, what we might call the political right or the conservatives of history, the ones who are now calling for the conservation of things, have always cancelled things, right? So they've always denied people a voice. They've always denied people a forum. We invade Iraq. The first thing we do is we destroy the statues of Saddam Hussein, right? So it's not like this is something that is radically new, right? So, at the aftermath of World War II, statues of Hitler, or, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, statues of Stalin, all these things have always fallen, right? So I don't think this process is in any way new, and it's what we've done to tyrants historically. So I do think, like, for instance, I live in the city of Bristol, and we have this kind of, the recent the throwing down of the statue of Edward Colston, and the first question is, should a statue have ever been erected to somebody who was a slave owner? Well, that raises interesting questions in itself about who we put on plinths. But I do think also that simply believing that you should erase or eradicate history is the wrong way of dealing with these things. Now, part of the problem, for instance, with the statue of Edward Colston was that people had been campaigning for 15 years, if not more, to have at least a plaque by the side of him, at least acknowledging his part in the slave trade history. Mm-hmm. But because of local politics, that never happened. So that, we might say, was a failure of the political process that took place. Now, I believe it's far better to have a statue of this guy in the city, and a subsequent statue by the side, which recognizes the history of slavery, because then you have a more open public dialogue. And I think, one of the things that always fascinates me about, Italy, when you go, especially to cities like Rome, that we might think on the one hand it's very problematic that, for instance, all the statues and the sculptures and the public parks which were erected by Mussolini are still intact. So you walk around the city of Rome, everything of Julius Caesar and these brutal tyrants of history are still there. They don't erase anything from history. And I think actually that's, when you think about it, it's more healthy for a conversation. even though they might become icons to fascist organizations, of course, right? But I still think fascists would find icons anyway. And I think it's too easy just to simply say, well, let's destroy this stuff and build a car park or, whatever else we want to do on this site, and to me, it's important that we remember, but not only remember, but make sure those symbols of memory become part of a public conversation. Now, of course, I recognize that certain statues can be deeply offensive for people, but I'm not convinced that the pulling of them down is necessarily the right way to go. Now, in terms of your other point then about the cancelling of television programs or cancelling of, I think it's a slippery slope in the sense of, first of all, we have like examples in the United Kingdom of, the history of our culture is deeply racist. Right? We know this in terms of, and we have like television programs like, which used like In Sickness and in Health, which were run in the 1980s, which were deeply racist programs. And even, there's elements of like Faulty Towers, which is a very famous comedy program in the UK, which is also has very racist elements to it. But it's a snapshot of life, what it was like in the UK at that time. And I think, I think it's important to recognize this and not ban them, but engage with them because you can watch these so-called comedies today and you don't laugh, right? You don't laugh at the jokes. You don't laugh at, the inherent bigotry to some of them. But that still doesn't mean you should ban them, because to me, they require engagement. They require reflection. It's not about, and the one thing which I'm never comfortable with the fact of banning anything, because nobody answers the ultimate question of who gets to decide. Right? And I look in terms of the United Kingdom today, and I look at the people who are calling for no platforming in universities, who are calling for certain art to be banned, certain films to be banned, certain books not to be published. They are the last people I would trust with deciding what's right for societies. I don't want those people telling me what's right. I class myself as, ethically sensitive. I understand the arguments around ethics. I understand, the debates around, homophobia, around racism, around the history of racism. I can recognize all that, and I can say, yes, this history is wrong, and we need to adjust this history. We need to change this history. We need to put history on a different direction. But some of the people who are calling for the banning of things, to me, are the last people I would trust in charge of culture, because their vision to me looks remarkably authoritarian in what they believe good culture to be. And to me, that also, it comes from a very clear position of actually middle-class cultural privilege, which I find very problematic.
So, I would like to take a step back into the conversation, and you made and just putting all this together, like when you said something very interesting, and that was about how left is actually talking about morality, and something what you've alluded in our previous answer as well. So that when left is saying that they are they have the right moral compass, but in that case, they are really pushing forward with the rise of populist leaders, because I see where left went wrong. That is why the rise of, say, Donald Trump actually happened, or why the right has actually arisen, or say Le Pen actually happened in France, and so on and so forth. So it's the mistakes of the left which has actually created the rise of the right. So are they recognizing that? Because that's actually an extreme form of morality that they're trying to impose. They're trying to push a certain level of thinking. And that's exactly what is happening right now with, say, removal of statues or the discourse that is happening. And you're certainly saying that this is not right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so, I think, first of all, you're right. The left has to come to terms with the ways in which, first of all, the left abandoned from the 1960s onward its most prominent constituency, namely broken communities. I grew up in the Welsh mining valleys, and the left always took those people for granted and never actually helped them. Now this is, the Welsh mining valley communities, if you know historically, this is the very place where the very first red flag of socialism flew historically. It's the birth of communism in this place, right? So, this is the birth of socialism. The left completely neglects them. So invariably, these communities eventually vote for Brexit. They levitate towards the right because the left failed them. The same as the ways in which for the Democrats in the United States of America, they completely neglected the so-called trailer trash communities, who immediately levitate to Trump because they believe that he is speaking for them. And I think the left has so much culpability in that neglect of poor communities. This is clear historically, right? And in that sense, then, but the left doesn't want to recognize that. But the left gets caught up then in its own internal violence of, there's this idea that, the right continually looks for converts, the left always looks for traitors. And you see this constantly, But I think, the loss of the election of Hillary Clinton was such a traumatic moment for the left. But of course, it was based on such entitlement. Because she was a woman, it was now her time to be leader, right? And this was completely preposterous, right? And she lost the election because she was entitled. The electorate could see through this completely. That it was now the time for this woman to lead the free world, and and rather than dealing with the substance of her ideas, which once again would have neglected the poor people of America. So I think, there is something in that we can kind of, collapse into this identity politics that we know can become so divisive for people. And I think then, you're right in terms of then how do we understand the way in which the left has gone? Well, particularly post Hillary Clinton, it's just descended into this moralism. It's become more and more moralizing, more and more unwilling to, and I think there's elements of the left today which confuse being radical with being religious. And they are now pronouncing their moral certitude upon the world, that they know what's right for everybody, that they have read all the books, they know all the arguments, and they behave like priests on social media. It's that we have the moral right to transform the world. And if you don't believe us, you have bad feelings, or you have bad faith, or you have bad emotions, or you have, and I think you have bad ideas and all this kind of stuff. And to me, somebody who's found themselves historically affiliated with, the left, who grew up in conditions of acute poverty, to see these debates being peddled by very well educated, very well privileged, middle class leftists who claim to know what it means to speak about poverty and injustice, I find very problematic.
So I fundamentally agree with what you're saying, but now the question that does arise is, how do we really set this right? Because if left is going to vacate the position in terms of not being intellectually robust or not really understanding the debates and just trying to impose, and then of course there is this rise of the right, if you might actually want to say, or the rise of the populist leaders, where will the world actually find some semblance or some balance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to me, there's a far more acute problem that we need to deal with right now. And this, again, to me, is one of the inherent contradictions of this emerging, what we might call the religious left right now. And which actually looks remarkably similar to the religious right in the United States of America in the 1980s, right? The ways in which they are taking the war to the cultural wars. And actually, you look at the very things which this kind of left is asking to close down. It's very similar, actually, to the arguments put forward by the religious right in the 1980s. So I think but there is, to me, a far greater problem that we need to confront right now, which this left has no concern with whatsoever, really. And that is the power of technology. So, we have all this divisive politics, which only enriches the undemocratic platforms of technology, Twitter being the obvious example, right? So if you've followed, for instance, some of these kind of spokespeople for this new moral left, which is taking place on social media during the lockdown, they were the first to rejoice when Twitter finally revealed that Donald Trump was expendable to them. They were calling for Twitter to shut down Donald Trump's account. They were calling for, these platforms to have more regulatory power to decide who can say what, when, and how. And this, to me, is, I find it unfathomable where, on the one hand, you have these very same people saying, oh, well, Britain's an undemocratic state or Europe's an undemocratic state, but let's give more power to social media, right? Which is the most undemocratic, faceless. If you ever have a problem with social media and you want to get it resolved, you realize completely how faceless this organization is. You can basically fill out a few algorithmic details and hope that your feedback will help them. Right? They never respond to you and say, actually, we're going to deal with your own specific query. Right? So, to me, these organizations, however dangerous Donald Trump was, I can't but help think that he was a distraction. Real power in the world today, if we understand power to transform societies, is now the technology companies, in a way in which we can barely comprehend. And the thing that I find remarkable about this new kind of, moral left is how they want to give more and more power to technology, because they realize their own gospels and platforms are enabled by these platforms. They want them to have a greater reach and a greater power. And that, to me, is where we need to really have a serious conversation. Because, this moral left also feeds off the divisions. The more divisions, the more outrage there is, the more they get to reaffirm how right they are in their moral positions. And I think this is only enabled by systems of technology. And I think if we are truly going to tackle power and the unequalness of power in the 21st century, we need to have a much more sustained conversation on the democratization of social media, the democratization of technology, and also to open up a serious critique of this moral dissent by certain people on the left, which also mimics the morality of the right as well, which, to me, the vast majority of people in between are simply saying, I'm sorry, but I don't identify with either of you. I don't see myself with you in this way. And actually, if we listen to social media, we can see this kind of religious right and this moral left kind of dominating the airways as if they are the only camps in town, right? And to me, we need to open up a conversation in between where we kind of ignore them in some ways and kind of say, well, actually, you don't speak for the majority of us. To me, like there's, I wrote a piece in the Times Higher Education supplement the other day, and I see this kind of creeping into academia now, where everything is now divided between these two kind of competing camps. Whereas to me, it's okay to kind of say, look, of course, I want greater diversity on university campuses, but I also need to question authenticity, right? I don't think that because somebody simply embodies a certain identity that they are necessarily the right person for the job. Or, for instance, I recognize the importance of thinking about this theory called intersectionality. But I'm also deeply troubled by this idea of white privilege when it's imposed upon poor white people who clearly have no privileges in this world. So I think it's okay to kind of show some nuance within these debates and say, well, actually, the world is not divided into these two camps which seem to be shouting the loudest, but actually, for the vast majority of the world, people were like, well, actually, I'm not so comfortable with identifying with you. And that's okay, right? So, and I think to understand that complexity is also important, I think.
This is quite interesting and powerful, but then one question that does get begged to be answered, and that is about surveillance that can actually happen because of technology. And I think everybody in the world seems to be oblivious of that fact, and that we are not realizing that how high level of surveillance can actually happen on us because of
Mhm,
the technologies that we are actually imbibing and using.
mhm. Yeah, well, so it's very common for people today to say that we are living in Orwellian times, right? That Orwell was right, and this idea of Big Brother that George Orwell put forward as everybody's being watched and managed. You know, George Orwell was wrong on so many levels, and you know, I'm a great admirer of the writings of Orwell. I think he's a formidable writer. But the thing that Orwell got wrong was that people are not suspicious of the invasiveness of people into their privacy. The opposite has proved itself to be true. That as humans, that we've been taught to desire the idea that if you are not being watched, you are a failure. If I don't have 1,000 or 10,000 Twitter followers who are following every move I do, then there is something wrong. I want to broadcast my life on social media, and I find it completely horrifying when I think, one of the advantages I think our generation used to have was the ability to reinvent yourself. I went to university, there was no social media. Nobody knew my past. I could kind of reinvent myself in a way where the past wasn't a burden for me. Of course, I didn't want people to know my past because it was a past of acute poverty. And that sense was part of a coping mechanism. For young people who were born into the world today, they have no luxury of that now. So it's not just surveillance of now, it's surveillance of our entire biographies historically. And everything is known about us, and we actively invest in this. And we think about this then in the context of the pandemic, where, this shift towards surveillance apps, which collapse every bit of data about our lives based on the premise of health and responsibility. And to me, this is deeply problematic. The ways in which the pandemic in particular can become very much like a foil for, the widespread biographical mapping of human life, where absolutely every intimate thought, feeling, illness can be public knowledge. And I think that to me is very problematic.
So this is again like probably it does scare me a lot in terms of like what you're saying. But one last question before we bring this conversation to a close, and we have already extended time. But then, how would you like to see the world? What do you think would be the ideal state if I have to ask you that question? Or how do you think, or how do you want the world to improve or change or move forward in the next, say, a decade or two?
Hmm. Well, well, the first thing is, it seems almost strange to say this now, but the first, more immediate return is simply human contact, right? So, I think we've realized through the pandemic how social we are as human beings. And so the first immediate response will be, well, okay, returning to some sense in which humans can actually just engage in public again is a good start point. But beyond that, I think, you know, how we engage more properly into the future would be certainly, a better conversation around the history of violence, a better conversation around the willingness to be open and respectful that people don't necessarily see the world as we do, and to recognize that we don't necessarily have the right answers to that. And also perhaps a more, appreciative understanding of the importance of art and culture to our societies. I think that truly that, you know, the best way to transform societies is through artistic and cultural enrichment, of which education and philosophy is a part of that. But that requires us to be open to things which we might find upsetting, things which are sometimes controversial. And it's strange to me that how the left in particular has lost its argument today. It's so fearful of cultural freedom, so fearful of cultural openness. And to me, that, the more cultural enrichment we have in the world, the better. But that sometimes means that we have to deal with art, which is provocative or unsettling. We have to deal with, ideas which are provocative or unsettling. But without that, the world doesn't move forward. We need, and I think this is an important point, I think perhaps as a final point I can say, whilst we need to critique violence, we need to also recognize that non-violent conflict is important for societies. We develop sometimes our best ideas through the conflict of ideas, through the conflict of, we think about, I can't think of any great work of art or great book written historically which didn't clash with something, which didn't come into a conflict of ideas. That is, there's this wonderful, and maybe we can end on this, there's this, wonderful poem which was written to me by one of the greatest artists to ever live, which was Charlie Chaplin. And Charlie Chaplin writes this poem about how I learned to love myself. And at the end of the poem, he says, and as I've learned that even stars collide, but out of this is given birth to a new earth. And I think there is something beautiful in this idea that we need to recognize that as humans, we need the conflict, because that conflict gives rise to new ideas. And that is where we need to have maybe a better understanding too.
This is absolutely great. And in fact, what I really take away, like from your last point, like two things, like try to appreciate perspectives and let the churn continue. I think this has just been an amazingly stimulating talk, Brad Evans. Thanks a lot for joining us today, and thanks for being with us. And I think this conversation could have gone on for a lot more time, but I look forward to hosting you once again sometime in the near future. Thank you, Brad Evans. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.